The morning air hung thick with tension as Colonel Marcus Rivera stared through his binoculars at the distant mountain peak. Somewhere on that rocky outcrop, nearly 4 kilometers away, sat their target. The enemy commander had been holed up there for 3 weeks, directing attacks that had cost them dozens of good soldiers. Every conventional approach had failed. Artillery couldn't reach the position due to the natural rock formations that provided perfect cover. Airstrikes were impossible because of the surface-to-air missiles protecting the area. That left only one option, a precision shot from an extreme distance. Rivera lowered his binoculars and turned to face the assembled group of elite marksmen standing at attention behind him. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Each man represented the pinnacle of military precision shooting. They had been handpicked from special forces units across 3 different armies, called in specifically for this impossible mission. Their combined experience totaled over 2 centuries of combat operations and sniper training. The first to step forward was Sergeant Jake Morrison, a weathered veteran with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. His service record spoke of confirmed kills at distances that most people couldn't even throw a baseball. Morrison had earned his reputation during urban combat operations where a single missed shot could mean the difference between saving civilians and causing a massacre. His hands were steady as rocks, and his breathing control was legendary among his peers. Morrison studied the target area through his scope for nearly 2 hours, accounting for wind patterns, temperature variations, humidity levels, and even the rotation of the Earth. At such extreme distances, factors that normally wouldn't matter became critical variables in the equation. He made careful adjustments to his rifle, a custom-built weapon that had cost more than most people's cars. Every component had been precisely calibrated for maximum accuracy. When Morrison finally took his shot, the bullet traveled for what felt like an eternity. Everyone held their breath as they watched through spotting scopes and binoculars. The projectile curved through the air, fighting against gravity and wind resistance, before finally impacting the rock face several meters to the left of the target position. The enemy commander remained safely hidden behind his protective barrier of stone and steel. The second attempt came from Master Sergeant Elena Volkov, a Russian sniper whose reputation had preceded her across international military circles. Volkov had learned her craft in the harsh conditions of Siberian training camps, where temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero and wind speeds could knock a grown man off his feet. She understood better than anyone how environmental factors could affect a bullet's trajectory over extreme distances. Volkov spent even longer than Morrison analyzing the conditions. She used advanced meteorological equipment to measure wind speeds at different altitudes, knowing that the bullet would encounter varying air currents during its 4-kilometer journey. Her rifle was equipped with the most sophisticated optics available, allowing her to see details that would be invisible to the naked eye. She made minute adjustments to her scope, compensating for the slight differences in atmospheric pressure compared to her weapon's 0 settings. Her shot was closer than Morrison's, but still not close enough. The bullet struck the rock formation just 2 meters from the target's position, sending chips of stone flying, but causing no real damage to the enemy commander or his equipment. Volkov shook her head in frustration, knowing that she had done everything technically correct, yet somehow the mountain itself seemed to be protecting their target. The third marksman was Staff Sergeant David Chun, whose background in competitive long-range shooting had made him a natural choice for military service. Chun approached the challenge differently than his predecessors. Instead of relying solely on environmental calculations, he studied the enemy's behavioral patterns. Through careful observation over several days, he had noticed that the target appeared at specific times, always in the same general area, suggesting a routine that could be exploited. Chun waited patiently for the optimal moment when atmospheric conditions aligned with the enemy's predicted appearance. His technique emphasized patience over quick action, believing that the perfect shot required perfect timing. When the moment finally arrived, his bullet flew true for most of its journey before being deflected by an unexpected gust of wind that hadn't been present during his hours of preparation. As the 4th, 5th, and 6th snipers took their turns, a pattern began to emerge. Each shooter was technically proficient, following all the proper procedures and making accurate calculations. Their equipment was top of the line, their training was extensive, and their experience was undeniable. Yet something about this particular target seemed to defy conventional long-range shooting wisdom. Sergeant First Class Tony Rodriguez brought a different perspective to the challenge. His background included extensive experience in mountain warfare, having served multiple tours in Afghanistan's treacherous terrain. Rodriguez understood how altitude and terrain could create unexpected atmospheric phenomena that standard meteorological equipment might not detect. He spent considerable time studying the mountain's topography, looking for hidden valleys or ridges that might be creating unusual wind patterns. Rodriguez's approach involved firing a series of tracer rounds at shorter distances to map the actual wind patterns rather than relying solely on instruments. This technique gave him valuable data about how air currents were behaving in the specific environment they faced. His shot came closer than any previous attempt, missing the target by less than a meter, but still not achieving the precise hit they desperately needed. The seventh sniper was Corporal Lisa Zhang, one of only 3 women among the assembled marksmen. Zhang's specialty was mathematical precision in ballistics calculations. She had developed her own software for computing bullet trajectories that took into account variables that standard military programs often overlooked. Her approach was methodical and scientific, treating each shot as a complex physics problem that could be solved through proper analysis. Zhang spent hours inputting data into her computer, calculating not just the basic ballistics, but also accounting for the Coriolis effect, air density variations at different altitudes, and even the gravitational differences caused by the mountain's mass. Her equipment included laser rangefinders accurate to within centimeters and wind meters that could detect air movement variations too subtle for human perception. Despite her thorough preparation and scientific approach, Zhang's bullet fell short by approximately 50 meters. The extreme distance had stretched even her advanced calculations beyond their limits of accuracy. She realized that at such ranges, there were simply too many variables that couldn't be precisely measured or predicted with current technology. The 8th through 11th snipers each brought their own unique skills and perspectives to the challenge. Master Sergeant William Foster specialized in urban sniping and had to adapt his close-quarters precision techniques to the extreme range. His bullet went wide by several meters. Sergeant Major Ahmad Hassan's experience with desert warfare didn't translate effectively to mountain conditions, and his shot impacted low. Senior Airman Jennifer Walsh's background in competition shooting provided technical excellence, but lacked the combat experience needed for such pressure situations. Staff Sergeant Robert Kim's expertise in night operations couldn't be fully utilized in the daylight conditions they faced. By the time the 12th sniper prepared for his attempt, doubt was beginning to creep into everyone's minds. Gunnery Sergeant Paul Martinez was known for his ability to make impossible shots under extreme pressure. His record included several confirmed kills at distances that had previously been considered beyond the effective range of standard military rifles. Martinez was the type of shooter who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of ballistics that went beyond textbook knowledge. Martinez took a completely different approach than his predecessors. Instead of spending hours analyzing conditions, he relied on his instincts and experience. He made quick adjustments based on what felt right rather than what calculations suggested. His philosophy was that at extreme ranges, there were too many unknown variables to account for mathematically, so the shooter had to trust their subconscious understanding of the weapon and environment. His shot was perhaps the most dramatic of all the attempts. The bullet seemed to fly perfectly for most of its journey, tracking directly toward the target area. For a moment, everyone thought Martinez had succeeded where all others had failed. But in the final moments of flight, the projectile drifted slightly off course, striking the rock formation just inches from the enemy commander's position. The 13th and final sniper was Sergeant First Class Michael O'Brien, whose reputation was built on his ability to perform under impossible conditions. O'Brien had made successful shots in blizzards, sandstorms, and under enemy fire. His mental toughness was legendary, and his ability to remain calm under pressure had saved countless lives during his military career. O'Brien studied not just the target and conditions, but also analyzed why each of the previous 12 attempts had failed. He looked for patterns in their misses, trying to identify any systematic error that might be affecting everyone's shots. His conclusion was that there was likely a consistent environmental factor that wasn't being properly accounted for in their calculations. Working with this theory, O'Brien made adjustments that differed significantly from standard long-range shooting protocols. He aimed in a direction that seemed counterintuitive based on visible wind conditions, trusting his analysis of the previous failures more than his own environmental observations. His shot was the closest yet, missing by mere inches, but still not achieving the mission-critical hit they needed. As the last echo of O'Brien's rifle shot faded across the mountain valley, a heavy silence settled over the assembled military personnel. 13 of the world's best snipers had failed to accomplish what should have been theoretically possible. The mathematics supported the feasibility of the shot. The equipment was more than adequate. The shooters were among the most skilled individuals on the planet. Yet the enemy commander remained safely positioned in his rocky fortress, continuing to direct attacks that were costing lives daily. Colonel Rivera felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had promised his superiors that this elite sniper team would solve their problem. Resources had been diverted from other critical missions to support this operation. Time was running out as enemy reinforcements were reportedly moving toward their position. The failure of the sniper mission might force them to attempt a costly ground assault that would likely result in heavy casualties. Standing nearby, Rivera noticed a figure that hadn't been part of the original sniper team. Maria Santos was a local guide who had been helping the military unit navigate the treacherous mountain terrain. She was in her mid-30s, with weathered hands and sun-darkened skin that spoke of a lifetime spent in these mountains. Santos had grown up in a small village nestled in the valley below, where hunting was not just a sport, but a necessity for survival. Santos approached Colonel Rivera with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place given the high-tech military operations surrounding them. She had been watching the sniper attempts with growing interest, observing not just the shooters, but also studying the mountain environment with eyes that had been trained from childhood to read the subtle signs of wind, weather, and terrain. When Santos spoke, her voice was steady and respectful but carried an undertone of certainty that caught Rivera's attention. She explained that she had noticed something about the wind patterns that the military meteorological equipment might be missing. Growing up in these mountains, she had learned to read atmospheric conditions in ways that couldn't be taught in any military academy. Rivera was initially skeptical about allowing a civilian to attempt what 13 elite military snipers had failed to accomplish. Santos had no formal military training, no advanced ballistics education, and no experience with the high-tech weapon systems that had been employed in the previous attempts. Her hunting rifle was a simple, well-maintained weapon that looked primitive compared to the sophisticated firearms the military snipers had been using. However, Rivera was also a practical commander who understood that conventional approaches weren't working. The mission was critical enough that unconventional solutions deserved consideration. Santos's intimate knowledge of the local environment might provide insights that outsiders couldn't possess, regardless of their technical training and expertise. Santos examined the target area through a basic pair of binoculars, spending less time on detailed analysis than any of the previous shooters. She wasn't calculating complex ballistics equations or using advanced meteorological instruments. Instead, she was reading the mountain the way someone might read a familiar book, understanding its moods and patterns through years of intimate experience. When Santos finally positioned herself behind her rifle, the contrast with the previous attempts was striking. Where the military snipers had used elaborate shooting rests, sophisticated scopes, and complex calculation systems, Santos relied on simple equipment and instinctive understanding. Her rifle was clean and well-maintained, but unremarkable. Her scope was clear and functional, but not equipped with the advanced features that had been standard on the military weapons. What Santos possessed that the elite snipers lacked was an intuitive understanding of how this particular mountain behaved. She knew that wind patterns could be deceptive, that atmospheric pressure could vary in unexpected ways, and that the mountain itself could create environmental conditions that standard instruments couldn't detect or predict. As Santos prepared for her shot, the assembled military personnel watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Many of them had decades of combined experience in long-range shooting, and they found it difficult to believe that a local hunter could succeed where elite military snipers had failed. The physical and technical challenges of hitting a target at 4,000 meters were extreme by any standard. Yet there was something about Santos's calm confidence that commanded respect. She wasn't boastful or overconfident. She simply seemed to understand something about the situation that others had missed. Her approach was methodical but not rushed, careful but not overthought. The mountain valley fell silent as Santos steadied her rifle and began her final preparations. Somewhere in the distance, an enemy commander continued to direct attacks from his seemingly impregnable position. The success or failure of the next few moments would determine whether lives would continue to be lost to his strategic planning. Everything depended on a simple woman with a basic rifle and a lifetime of mountain wisdom. Maria Santos adjusted her position behind the rifle with movements that seemed almost casual compared to the intense preparations of the 13 military snipers who had preceded her. She had been born in these mountains 34 years ago, delivered by her grandmother in a small stone cottage that had stood in the valley for over a century. Her childhood had been spent learning to read the mountain's moods, understanding how clouds formed around certain peaks, how wind patterns shifted with the seasons, and how the terrain itself could influence atmospheric conditions in ways that were invisible to outsiders. Santos's father, Eduardo, had been a legendary hunter in the region. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to track animals across seemingly impossible terrain and make shots that defied explanation. Eduardo had never attended formal school, but his understanding of ballistics came from decades of experience feeding his family with a rifle. He had taught his daughter that successful hunting required more than technical skill. It demanded a deep connection with the environment and an intuitive understanding of natural forces. Growing up, Santos had accompanied her father on hunting expeditions that often lasted for days. They would climb to elevations where the air was thin and cold, where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall down a rocky cliff face. Eduardo had taught her to observe everything. The way morning mist clung to certain valleys, how afternoon thermal currents created updrafts along specific ridgelines, and how the mountain's granite formations could channel wind in unexpected directions. The rifle Santos now held had belonged to her father before his death 5 years earlier. It was a well-maintained hunting rifle that had put meat on their table for over 2 decades. The weapon showed signs of careful use, with minor scratches on the stock that told stories of countless hunting trips. The scope was clear and properly zeroed, but it lacked the advanced features of military optics. There were no range-finding capabilities, no automatic environmental compensation systems, no computer-assisted ballistics calculations. What the rifle possessed was something that couldn't be purchased or programmed. It had been used by someone who understood these mountains intimately. Eduardo had taken shots with this weapon at distances that most hunters would consider impossible. He had compensated for wind, elevation, temperature, and atmospheric pressure using knowledge passed down through generations of mountain dwellers. Santos placed her cheek against the rifle stock in a position that felt as natural as breathing. She had fired this weapon thousands of times over the years, first under her father's careful supervision, then, later as the primary hunter for her family after his death. Every component of the rifle was familiar to her touch. She knew exactly how the trigger broke, how the recoil felt, and how to maintain perfect consistency in her shooting position. The target area, nearly 4 kilometers away, appeared as a small dark spot through her scope. At such extreme distance, even minor atmospheric disturbances could deflect a bullet by several meters. Santos didn't try to calculate these factors mathematically. Instead, she relied on senses that had been developed through years of mountain hunting. She could feel atmospheric pressure changes in her bones, detect subtle wind shifts through almost imperceptible changes in air movement across her skin. Colonel Rivera watched Santos with growing fascination. Her approach was completely different from anything he had observed during his military career. Where trained snipers relied on technology and systematic procedures, Santos seemed to be having a conversation with the mountain itself. She would pause occasionally, tilting her head slightly as if listening to something that others couldn't hear. The assembled military personnel maintained respectful silence, but Rivera could sense their skepticism. These were individuals trained in the most advanced shooting techniques available. They had access to equipment that represented millions of dollars in research and development. The idea that a local hunter could succeed where they had failed challenged fundamental assumptions about modern military superiority. Master Sergeant Morrison, the first sniper to attempt the shot, found himself studying Santos with professional curiosity. He had noticed subtle environmental factors that his instruments hadn't detected, but he couldn't identify exactly what she was seeing that he had missed. Her movements were economical and purposeful, lacking the elaborate preparation rituals that had characterized the military attempts. Santos spent several minutes observing the target area, but her observation was different from the methodical analysis performed by the trained snipers. She wasn't calculating wind speed in meters per second or measuring atmospheric pressure in millibars. Instead, she was reading the mountain's behavior through signs that couldn't be quantified by instruments. She noticed how dust particles moved in the distance, indicating wind patterns that weren't detected by the meteorological equipment. She observed the way heat waves shimmered near certain rock formations, suggesting thermal currents that could affect bullet trajectory. Most importantly, she recognized atmospheric conditions that were unique to this particular mountain at this specific time of day. The mountain where the enemy commander was positioned had characteristics that created unusual environmental phenomena. Its granite composition and specific orientation to the sun created thermal effects that weren't typical in other locations. Santos had observed this mountain under various conditions for decades, hunting on its slopes and understanding its behavioral patterns. As Santos prepared for her shot, she remembered her father's teachings about patience and timing. Eduardo had emphasized that successful long-range shooting wasn't about forcing the shot to work despite adverse conditions. Instead, it required waiting for the moment when all factors aligned naturally. He had taught her to feel the rhythm of the mountain, to understand when atmospheric conditions were stable and when they were in flux. Santos could sense that the mountain was approaching a period of relative atmospheric stability. The thermal currents that had been active during the morning hours were beginning to settle as the sun reached its midday position. Wind patterns that had been chaotic and unpredictable were showing signs of becoming more consistent and predictable. The moment Santos had been waiting for arrived with a subtle shift in air pressure that she felt more than observed. The mountain seemed to pause in its constant atmospheric activity, creating a brief window of relative stability. This was the moment her father had taught her to recognize, when the natural forces that normally interfered with long-range shooting temporarily aligned in favor of the shooter. Santos settled into her firing position with movements that were smooth and natural. She didn't fight against the rifle or force her body into an uncomfortable position. Instead, she allowed her natural anatomy to support the weapon in a way that felt balanced and sustainable. Her breathing became slow and rhythmic, not through conscious control, but through instinctive relaxation. Through her scope, Santos could see the target area with clarity that surprised even her. The atmospheric conditions that had been creating distortion and mirage effects earlier in the day had settled into relative stability. The enemy commander's position was clearly visible, though still extremely distant. Santos could make out details that confirmed the intelligence reports about his location and equipment. The shot required compensation for multiple environmental factors, but Santos approached these calculations through intuition rather than mathematics. She understood how bullets behaved at extreme distances because she had observed their flight paths thousands of times. Her adjustments were based on feel and experience rather than scientific formulas. Santos's finger found the trigger with practiced ease. The weapon felt like an extension of her body rather than a separate tool. She had fired this rifle in conditions ranging from winter blizzards to summer heat waves, always adapting her technique to match the environmental requirements of each situation. The moment of firing arrived without drama or announcement. Santos simply reached the natural conclusion of her preparation process and allowed the shot to happen. The trigger broke cleanly, sending the bullet on its 4-kilometer journey toward the target. There was no hesitation, no last-minute doubt, no second-guessing of her environmental observations. The bullet's flight time at such extreme distance meant several seconds of suspense for everyone observing the attempt. Santos remained in position, following the projectile's trajectory through her scope, while others used binoculars and spotting scopes to track its progress. The bullet curved through the air, fighting against gravity and atmospheric resistance, maintaining its course toward the distant target. Everyone held their breath as the bullet approached its destination. After 13 failed attempts by elite military snipers, the possibility of success by an untrained civilian seemed almost impossible. Yet there was something about Santos's calm confidence that made success feel achievable. The impact was visible through long-range optics as a small puff of debris near the target position. Initial observations suggested that the bullet had struck very close to the intended point of impact, possibly achieving the precision that had eluded the military snipers. However, confirmation of the actual hit required careful observation through the most powerful spotting scopes available. Colonel Rivera focused his binoculars on the target area, searching for any indication of whether Santos had achieved what others had failed to accomplish. The distance made immediate assessment difficult, and the enemy position was partially concealed by natural rock formations that blocked direct observation. Sergeant Morrison, using a high-powered spotting scope, was the first to confirm what everyone hoped to see. The enemy commander's position showed clear signs of impact. Equipment that had been visible in the target area was no longer present, and there was no movement from the location that had been actively used for directing enemy operations. Secondary confirmation came from communication intercepts that indicated confusion and disruption in enemy command structure. Radio traffic suggested that their field commander was no longer responsive, and Subordinate units were requesting instructions that weren't being provided. The tactical situation that had been stable for weeks suddenly showed signs of enemy uncertainty and disorganization. The success of Santos's shot created an atmosphere of amazement among the military personnel who had witnessed the event. 13 elite snipers with advanced training, sophisticated equipment, and extensive combat experience had failed to achieve what a local hunter accomplished with basic equipment and intuitive understanding of environmental conditions. Colonel Rivera approached Santos with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. He wanted to understand how she had succeeded where others had failed, what environmental factors she had observed that military instruments had missed, and how her approach had differed from conventional long-range shooting techniques. Santos's explanation was simple and direct. She had grown up with this mountain and understood its behavior in ways that couldn't be learned from textbooks or instruments. The atmospheric conditions that had defeated the military snipers were familiar to her from years of hunting experience. She had simply waited for the right moment and trusted her understanding of how bullets behaved in this specific environment. The success of the mission had implications that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Enemy forces in the region began withdrawing when they realized their command structure had been compromised. Operations that had been stalled for weeks suddenly showed progress as resistance diminished. The psychological impact of losing their field commander created uncertainty that affected enemy morale and effectiveness. For Santos, the attention and praise felt overwhelming after a lifetime of quiet mountain existence. She had simply applied hunting skills that seemed natural and obvious to her. The idea that military experts found her abilities remarkable was surprising, since she had been using similar techniques to provide food for her family for decades. The rifle that had accomplished the impossible shot was returned to its normal role as a hunting weapon. Santos had no interest in military applications or recognition beyond the immediate mission. She preferred the quiet rhythms of mountain life to the complex world of military operations and strategic planning. However, word of Santos's achievement began to spread beyond the immediate military unit. Reports filtered back to higher command levels, generating interest from ballistics experts and military training specialists. The possibility that traditional hunting techniques might offer insights for modern military applications intrigued researchers and theorists. Santos found herself facing requests for interviews and consultations that she had no interest in pursuing. Her knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, based on experience rather than education. She couldn't explain her techniques in ways that satisfied scientific curiosity or military systematic analysis. The mountain valley gradually returned to its normal peaceful state as military operations concluded and personnel began returning to their regular assignments. Santos resumed her traditional role as a guide and hunter, helping occasional visitors navigate the treacherous terrain that had been her home for over 3 decades. Yet the story of the 13 failed snipers and the woman who succeeded at 4,000 meters had only just begun to unfold. 3 weeks after the successful shot, Major General Patricia Hayes arrived at the mountain base camp with a small team of ballistics experts and military researchers. Hayes commanded the Army's Advanced Marksmanship Research Division, a specialized unit responsible for developing new sniper training techniques and equipment. Word of Santos's achievement had reached the highest levels of military command, generating intense curiosity about how an untrained civilian had accomplished what elite military snipers could not. Hayes was a career officer with over 20 years of experience in special operations. She had personally trained some of the world's best military marksmen and had overseen the development of advanced shooting systems that pushed the boundaries of long-range precision. The idea that someone without formal training could outperform her carefully selected snipers challenged her fundamental understanding of marksmanship science. Santos was initially reluctant to meet with military officials. She had completed her part in the mission and wanted to return to her normal life in the mountain village. The attention from military researchers felt intrusive and unnecessary. Her knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, gained through necessity rather than academic study. She worried that military officials would try to turn her hunting skills into something they were never intended to be. Colonel Rivera served as an intermediary, explaining to Santos that her techniques might help save military lives in future operations. The research wouldn't interfere with her daily life, but could provide insights that would benefit soldiers facing similar challenges. Santos eventually agreed to cooperate with the investigation, though she remained skeptical about the value of analyzing intuitive skills that couldn't be easily explained. The research team set up sophisticated equipment to measure environmental conditions during Santos's shooting demonstrations. They installed weather monitoring stations at various elevations, deployed laser-based wind measurement systems, and used advanced ballistics tracking equipment to analyze bullet trajectories. The goal was to understand exactly what environmental factors Santos was detecting that their instruments had missed. Santos agreed to demonstrate her shooting technique using both her own rifle and military weapons systems. The researchers wanted to determine whether her success was due to equipment familiarity or environmental awareness that could be applied to different firearms. They prepared targets at various distances, starting with ranges that were challenging but achievable for trained marksmen, then gradually extending to the extreme distances that had proved problematic. The initial demonstrations took place at distances of 1,000 meters, well within the proven capabilities of military sniper systems. Santos performed adequately, but not exceptionally at these ranges. Her technique was sound, but didn't show the remarkable precision that would distinguish her from trained military marksmen. The researchers began to wonder whether her success at 4,000 meters had been largely due to luck rather than skill. As the test distances increased to 2,000 and 3,000 meters, Santos's performance began to show characteristics that distinguished her from conventional shooters. She spent considerably more time observing environmental conditions before each shot, but her observations focused on factors that the monitoring equipment didn't seem to detect. She would test wind direction by releasing small amounts of dust or dried grass, watching how the particles moved in ways that electronic wind sensors couldn't measure. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a ballistics physicist on the research team, became particularly interested in Santos's environmental observation techniques. Martinez had spent years developing computer models for long-range shooting that accounted for dozens of atmospheric variables. Yet Santos seemed to be detecting environmental factors that weren't included in even the most sophisticated ballistics calculations. Martinez began following Santos during her observation periods, trying to understand what environmental cues she was using to make shooting decisions. Santos explained that she wasn't making conscious calculations, but rather feeling atmospheric conditions through senses that had been developed over decades of mountain hunting. She could detect subtle pressure changes, temperature variations, and air movement patterns that instruments couldn't measure or that occurred too locally to be captured by monitoring equipment. The breakthrough in understanding came when Santos demonstrated her technique at a distance of 3,800 meters, nearly matching the range of her successful mission shot. The research team's instruments detected stable atmospheric conditions that should have supported accurate long-range shooting. However, Santos refused to take the shot, insisting that the atmospheric conditions were unsuitable despite what the monitoring equipment indicated. Santos explained that the mountain was experiencing microclimate conditions that the instruments couldn't detect. She pointed to subtle signs in cloud formations, air movement patterns, and thermal currents that suggested atmospheric instability despite the favorable readings on electronic monitoring systems. She was willing to wait for conditions that felt right rather than forcing a shot during technically favorable but intuitively problematic circumstances. 2 hours later, Santos announced that conditions had become suitable for the long-range shot. The research team's instruments showed minimal changes from the earlier readings, yet Santos was confident that the atmospheric environment had shifted in favor of accurate shooting. She positioned herself behind her rifle and made the shot with the same calm confidence that had characterized her mission's success. The bullet struck within inches of the intended target at 3,800 meters, demonstrating precision that matched the performance of the most advanced military sniper systems under ideal conditions. The researchers were amazed that Santos had achieved such accuracy while their instruments indicated atmospheric conditions that were nearly identical to the earlier period when she had refused to shoot. Dr. Martinez began analyzing the data more carefully, looking for subtle patterns that might explain Santos's environmental sensitivity. She discovered that while major atmospheric measurements remained relatively stable, there were minor fluctuations in air pressure, humidity, and temperature that created brief windows of enhanced atmospheric stability. These fluctuations occurred on a scale too small and brief to be reliably detected by standard meteorological equipment. Santos's environmental awareness allowed her to detect these brief stability windows through sensory cues that had been developed over decades of mountain hunting. She could feel atmospheric pressure changes through subtle effects on her inner ear, detect humidity variations through skin sensation, and observe temperature differences through almost imperceptible changes in air movement patterns. The research team realized that Santos wasn't just a skilled marksman, but rather someone who had developed an intuitive understanding of atmospheric physics that surpassed their scientific instruments. Her techniques weren't anti-scientific, but rather based on environmental awareness that exceeded the sensitivity of current monitoring technology. Major General Hayes began to understand that Santos's success represented an opportunity to enhance military training rather than replace technical approaches with intuitive methods. The goal wasn't to abandon scientific ballistics calculations, but rather to supplement them with environmental awareness techniques that could detect atmospheric factors beyond the range of electronic sensors. Hayes proposed a collaborative research program that would combine Santos's environmental observation techniques with advanced military training methods. The program would teach military snipers to develop enhanced atmospheric sensitivity while maintaining their technical skills and equipment advantages. Santos would work with military instructors to develop training exercises that enhanced environmental awareness. Santos was initially resistant to the idea of teaching her techniques to military personnel. Her knowledge was personal and intuitive, developed through years of hunting necessity rather than systematic training. She wasn't confident that her environmental awareness could be transferred to others, especially people who hadn't grown up in mountain environments where such sensitivity was essential for survival. However, Colonel Rivera convinced Santos that her cooperation could prevent military casualties in future operations. Soldiers facing similar long-range shooting challenges might benefit from enhanced environmental awareness that could supplement their technical training. Santos agreed to participate in a limited training program that would test whether her techniques could be taught to others. The experimental training program began with 5 volunteer military snipers who had demonstrated exceptional technical skills, but had been among those who failed during the original mission. The volunteers were Master Sergeant Morrison, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, Corporal Zhang, Sergeant Major Hassan, and Staff Sergeant Kim. Each brought different strengths and backgrounds to the training program. Santos's teaching approach was completely different from standard military instruction methods. Instead of classroom lectures and systematic skill development, she focused on helping the soldiers develop enhanced sensory awareness through practical exercises. The training took place entirely outdoors, where participants could experience actual atmospheric conditions rather than theoretical descriptions. The initial exercises focused on basic environmental observation without firearms. Santos taught the soldiers to detect wind patterns by watching grass movement, cloud formations, and dust particle behavior. She showed them how to feel atmospheric pressure changes through effects on their bodies, and how to observe temperature variations through visual cues that weren't measurable by instruments. Morrison, who had been the first sniper to attempt the original mission, found Santos's teaching methods challenging to adapt to his systematic military training background. He was accustomed to relying on quantifiable data and proven procedures rather than subjective environmental observations. However, he gradually began to notice atmospheric subtleties that he had previously overlooked. Rodriguez, with his mountain warfare experience, adapted more quickly to Santos's training methods. His background in challenging terrain operations had already developed some environmental awareness, though not to the degree that Santos demonstrated. He began to understand how his previous mountain experience had been incomplete, focusing on tactical considerations rather than atmospheric sensitivity. Corporal Zhang approached the training from her mathematical background, initially trying to quantify Santos's observations through scientific analysis. However, she gradually learned to trust sensory inputs that couldn't be measured or calculated. This represented a significant shift from her technically oriented approach to long-range shooting. The training program extended over several weeks, with Santos gradually introducing more advanced environmental observation techniques. She taught the soldiers to recognize atmospheric stability windows, detect microclimate variations, and understand how terrain features influenced local weather patterns. The instruction was practical rather than theoretical, based on actual observation rather than classroom learning. As the training progressed, Santos began incorporating shooting exercises that required the soldiers to apply their enhanced environmental awareness to actual marksmanship situations. The exercises started with moderate distances and gradually extended to the extreme ranges that had proved challenging during the original mission. The results were remarkable. Soldiers who had previously relied solely on technical equipment and systematic procedures began achieving accuracy improvements that surprised even Santos. Their enhanced environmental awareness allowed them to detect atmospheric conditions that supported improved long-range shooting performance. However, The training also revealed limitations in how quickly and completely environmental awareness could be developed. Santos's lifetime of mountain experience couldn't be replicated in a few weeks of intensive instruction. The soldiers learned to observe environmental factors more effectively, but they hadn't developed the intuitive sensitivity that allowed Santos to detect subtle atmospheric changes that instruments couldn't measure. Major General Hayes realized that the research program had identified important principles for enhancing military sniper training, even if Santos's complete environmental sensitivity couldn't be fully transferred to others. The combination of technical skills with enhanced environmental awareness created a more capable marksman than either approach alone could produce. The success of the experimental training program led to discussions about broader implementation of environmental awareness training in military sniper schools. However, these discussions also raised questions about how to maintain the effectiveness of Santos's techniques when applied on a larger scale with instructors who lacked her unique background and sensitivity. Santos's role in the military research program was approaching its conclusion, but the implications of her techniques were just beginning to be understood by the broader military training community. 6 months after the successful training program, word of Santos's remarkable achievement had spread throughout international military communities. Defense officials from 7 different countries requested demonstrations of her techniques, hoping to incorporate environmental awareness training into their own sniper programs. What had begun as a single desperate mission had evolved into a potential revolution in long-range marksmanship training. Santos found herself reluctantly agreeing to travel beyond her mountain home for the first time in her adult life. The requests came through official diplomatic channels, with governments offering substantial compensation for her consultation services. Colonel Rivera, who had become something of a mentor and advocate, convinced Santos that her knowledge could benefit military personnel worldwide who faced similar challenging shooting situations. The first international demonstration took place at a military training facility in Canada, where Arctic conditions created environmental challenges similar to those Santos had grown up with in her mountain environment. Canadian forces had been struggling with long-range shooting accuracy in extreme cold weather conditions, where standard ballistics calculations often proved inadequate due to temperature effects on ammunition and atmospheric density changes. Brigadier General Robert Thompson commanded the Canadian training facility and had invited Santos specifically to address cold weather shooting challenges. Thompson's snipers were technically excellent under normal conditions, but consistently experienced accuracy problems when operating in Arctic environments where temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Santos's first observation at the Canadian facility was that military personnel were trying to fight against environmental conditions rather than working with them. The extreme cold created atmospheric effects that actually enhanced long-range shooting accuracy under certain circumstances, but only if the shooter understood how to recognize and utilize these conditions properly. The Canadian snipers were using heating equipment to maintain comfortable shooting positions, wearing heavy insulated clothing that restricted natural movement, and relying on electronic equipment that often malfunctioned in extreme temperatures. Santos demonstrated that successful cold weather shooting required adapting to environmental conditions rather than trying to eliminate their effects. Santos's Canadian demonstrations took place in temperatures that most people would find unbearable. She wore basic cold weather clothing that allowed natural movement and sensory awareness rather than maximum insulation. Her rifle was a simple hunting weapon similar to her mountain rifle, chosen for reliability in extreme conditions rather than advanced features that might fail in Arctic weather. The atmospheric conditions created by extreme cold produced unique environmental phenomena that Santos had learned to recognize during winter hunting in her mountain home. Supercooled air created density variations that affected bullet trajectory differently than standard ballistics tables predicted. However, these same conditions also created periods of exceptional atmospheric stability that could enhance long-range accuracy for shooters who understood how to detect and utilize them. Santos's first shot in Canadian conditions was at a distance of 2,800 meters in temperatures of 35 degrees below zero. Canadian snipers had consistently struggled with accuracy at such ranges under these conditions, despite extensive training and sophisticated equipment. Santos studied the environmental conditions for nearly an hour before positioning herself for the shot. The Canadian observers were skeptical about Santos's extended preparation time, as their training emphasized rapid target engagement to minimize exposure to extreme conditions. However, Santos explained that successful shooting in Arctic conditions required patience to identify the brief periods when atmospheric factors aligned favorably despite the harsh overall environment. When Santos finally took her shot, the bullet struck within 6 inches of the intended target at 2,800 meters. The Canadian snipers were amazed that such accuracy was possible under conditions they had found nearly impossible to work with effectively. Santos's success demonstrated that extreme cold weather could enhance rather than hinder long-range shooting accuracy when approached with proper environmental understanding. The Canadian training program that followed Santos's demonstration lasted 3 weeks and involved 12 selected snipers from various Arctic operations units. Santos taught them to recognize atmospheric stability indicators in cold weather conditions, detect temperature-related wind patterns, and understand how extreme cold affected ballistics in ways that weren't accounted for in standard military training. The results exceeded expectations. Canadian snipers who had previously struggled with cold weather accuracy began achieving precision that matched their temperate climate performance. Several participants exceeded their previous long-range shooting records under Arctic conditions that they had formerly considered prohibitive for accurate marksmanship. News of Santos's success in Canada reached military officials in northern European countries where similar cold weather challenges affected military operations. The Norwegian Defense Ministry extended an invitation for Santos to demonstrate her techniques in Arctic conditions even more extreme than those encountered in Canada. The Norwegian demonstration took place above the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures could reach 50 degrees below zero, and atmospheric conditions created unique challenges for long-range shooting. Norwegian forces operated in environments where traditional ballistics calculations often proved completely inadequate due to extreme atmospheric density variations and unpredictable wind patterns created by Arctic terrain features. Colonel Erik Andersen commanded the Norwegian Arctic Training Facility and had been following reports of Santos's achievements with professional interest. Andersen's snipers were among the most technically advanced in the world, equipped with cutting-edge equipment designed specifically for extreme weather operations. However, they consistently experienced accuracy problems at extended ranges under the most severe Arctic conditions. Santos's Norwegian demonstrations revealed environmental awareness techniques that exceeded even her previous achievements. The extreme Arctic conditions created atmospheric phenomena that were more pronounced than anything she had encountered in her mountain home or the Canadian facilities. However, her environmental sensitivity allowed her to detect stability patterns within the atmospheric chaos that others couldn't perceive. The Norwegian shooting demonstrations took place at distances up to 4,200 meters, exceeding even the range of Santos's original mission success. Arctic atmospheric conditions created both challenges and opportunities for extreme long-range shooting that weren't present in temperate climates. Santos demonstrated shots that Norwegian personnel had considered impossible under their operating conditions. The international attention that Santos's achievements generated led to requests from military research institutions in the United States, Germany, and Australia. Each country faced unique environmental challenges for long-range shooting operations, from desert heat effects to mountainous terrain complications to coastal atmospheric variations that affected ballistics calculations. Dr. Sarah Chun, a ballistics researcher at the United States Army Research Laboratory, became particularly interested in the scientific principles underlying Santos's environmental awareness techniques. Chun had spent years developing computer models for atmospheric effects on long-range shooting, but Santos's achievements suggested that current scientific understanding was incomplete. Chun proposed a comprehensive research project that would analyze Santos's techniques using advanced scientific instrumentation while she demonstrated her environmental awareness under controlled conditions. The research would attempt to identify the specific atmospheric factors that Santos detected through sensory awareness that current instruments couldn't measure effectively. The American research project took place at the Army's Proving Grounds in Arizona, where desert conditions created different environmental challenges than the mountain and Arctic environments where Santos had previously demonstrated her techniques. Desert shooting involved extreme temperature variations, unpredictable thermal currents, and atmospheric effects that differed significantly from Santos's mountain experience. Santos initially struggled with desert conditions because her environmental awareness techniques had been developed specifically for mountain terrain and climate patterns. The atmospheric behavior in desert environments followed different patterns than those she had learned to recognize during her lifetime in mountain hunting situations. However, Santos's fundamental approach to environmental observation proved adaptable to new conditions. She spent several weeks learning to recognize desert atmospheric patterns, developing new environmental awareness techniques that applied her basic sensory sensitivity to unfamiliar terrain and climate effects. The desert demonstrations revealed that Santos's environmental awareness was based on fundamental atmospheric sensitivity that could be adapted to various environments rather than specific knowledge limited to mountain conditions. Her techniques were transferable to different climates and terrain types, though adaptation required time and experience that couldn't be rushed. Dr. Chin's research identified several atmospheric factors that Santos detected through sensory awareness that weren't measured by standard meteorological equipment. These included microscale air pressure variations, localized humidity changes, and temperature gradients that occurred on scales too small for conventional weather monitoring systems to detect reliably. The scientific analysis of Santos's techniques led to development of enhanced atmospheric monitoring equipment that could detect some of the environmental factors she observed through sensory awareness. However, the research also revealed that Santos's environmental sensitivity exceeded the capabilities of any practical monitoring system that could be deployed in field conditions. Meanwhile, Santos was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the attention and analysis that her achievements had generated. She had agreed to help military personnel improve their capabilities, but the scientific research and international demonstrations were taking her far from her mountain home and simple hunting lifestyle that she preferred. The constant travel and technical analysis felt overwhelming to someone who had spent most of her life in quiet mountain villages where her hunting skills were simply practical tools for providing food rather than subjects for scientific study. Santos began to consider returning to her mountain home and declining further military consultation requests. However, reports from military units that had implemented environmental awareness training based on Santos's techniques indicated significant improvements in operational effectiveness. Casualty rates in units with enhanced environmental training were measurably lower than those using conventional approaches. Santos's knowledge was literally saving lives in military operations worldwide. Colonel Rivera, who had maintained contact with Santos throughout her international consultation work, convinced her to participate in one final major project that would develop standardized training materials based on her techniques. The project would allow her to return to her mountain home while ensuring that her knowledge could benefit military personnel without requiring her personal involvement in future training programs. The Standardized Training Development Project represented both a culmination of Santos's military consultation work and her transition back to the quiet mountain life she preferred. However, the implications of her environmental awareness techniques continued to influence military training programs and long-range shooting research worldwide. The woman who had succeeded where 13 elite snipers failed was finally ready to return home, leaving behind a legacy that would influence military marksmanship training for generations to come. 2 years after her impossible shot that had defeated 13 elite military snipers, Maria Santos stood once again in her mountain valley, watching the morning mist rise from the familiar peaks that had shaped her understanding of atmospheric conditions. She had returned home 6 months earlier after completing the Standardized Training Development Project, ready to resume the quiet hunting and guiding life that felt natural to her. However, Santos discovered that her mountain home had been forever changed by the international attention her achievements had generated. Military researchers from various countries had established a permanent atmospheric monitoring station in the valley, using sophisticated equipment to study the unique environmental conditions that had contributed to her remarkable shooting success. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the ballistics physicist who had been part of the original research team, had requested permission to maintain a small scientific facility in the area. Martinez's long-term research project focused on understanding atmospheric microclimates in mountainous terrain and their effects on long-range ballistics. The research had implications beyond military applications, potentially benefiting meteorology, atmospheric physics, and climate science. Santos found herself in the unexpected role of local consultant for the scientific research station. Her environmental knowledge helped researchers understand atmospheric phenomena that their instruments detected but couldn't fully explain. The collaboration between Santos's intuitive awareness and scientific measurement techniques was producing insights that neither approach could achieve independently. The research station had also attracted attention from civilian long-range shooting enthusiasts who wanted to understand Santos's techniques for competitive shooting applications. Precision rifle competitions were beginning to incorporate environmental awareness training based on modified versions of Santos's methods, creating a new approach to competitive marksmanship that emphasized atmospheric sensitivity alongside technical skill. Santos was initially resistant to civilian attention, preferring to focus on the scientific research that seemed more directly beneficial than competitive shooting applications. However, she gradually realized that teaching environmental awareness to civilian shooters could help preserve traditional hunting knowledge that was being lost as younger generations moved away from rural mountain communities. A small training center was established in the valley, offering courses in environmental awareness for both military personnel and civilian shooters. Santos participated in the training programs on a limited basis, teaching fundamental environmental observation techniques, while other instructors handled the more technical aspects of marksmanship training. The training center attracted participants from around the world who wanted to learn Santos's environmental awareness methods. Students included competitive shooters, military personnel, hunting guides, and atmospheric researchers interested in developing enhanced environmental sensitivity. The courses combined practical outdoor observation with scientific understanding of atmospheric physics. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the original 13 snipers who had failed to make the 4-kilometer shot, became a regular instructor at the training center after completing advanced environmental awareness training. Walsh had discovered that combining her technical military training with Santos's environmental techniques created shooting capabilities that exceeded either approach alone. Walsh's experience demonstrated that Santos's environmental awareness could enhance rather than replace technical military training. Students who learned to combine instrument-based environmental monitoring with sensory atmospheric sensitivity achieved consistency and accuracy improvements that surprised even experienced shooting instructors. The training center's success led to requests from hunting organizations interested in preserving traditional environmental knowledge that was disappearing as rural populations moved to urban areas. Santos found herself teaching hunting techniques that her father and grandfather had passed down through generations, knowledge that represented centuries of accumulated environmental wisdom. These hunting education programs attracted participants who weren't necessarily interested in extreme long-range shooting, but wanted to understand how traditional hunters developed such intimate knowledge of natural environments. The courses covered wildlife tracking, weather prediction, terrain navigation, and environmental observation techniques that had practical applications beyond marksmanship. Santos discovered that teaching traditional hunting knowledge was more personally satisfying than the military consultation work she had completed earlier. The hunting education programs connected her with people who shared her appreciation for mountain environments and traditional skills that were in danger of being lost to modern technology. However, Santos's involvement in civilian education also created new challenges. Some participants expected to achieve her level of environmental sensitivity through short-term courses, not understanding that her abilities had been developed through a lifetime of mountain experience and necessity-driven skill development. Santos had to learn how to explain the limitations of what could be taught in formal training programs while still providing valuable environmental awareness education. She emphasized that her techniques were starting points for developing environmental sensitivity rather than complete systems that could be mastered quickly. The most significant long-term impact of Santos's achievements became apparent when military casualty statistics from units using environmental awareness training showed measurable reductions in operational losses. Soldiers trained in enhanced environmental observation were better able to detect atmospheric conditions that supported successful long-range engagements while avoiding situations where environmental factors made accurate shooting unlikely. Colonel Rivera, who had been promoted to general following the success of operations that incorporated Santos's techniques, compiled a comprehensive report on the military effectiveness of environmental awareness training. The report documented improved operational success rates, reduced ammunition consumption, and decreased casualty rates in units that had implemented Santos's methods. Rivera's report led to official adoption of environmental awareness training in several national military sniper programs. The training became part of standard military education rather than specialized techniques available only to elite units. Thousands of military personnel received instruction based on Santos's environmental observation methods. The widespread adoption of environmental awareness training created demand for instructors who understood both Santos's techniques and military training requirements. A cadre of specialists developed who could teach environmental sensitivity within existing military education frameworks, ensuring that Santos's knowledge would continue to benefit military personnel without requiring her personal involvement. Dr. Martinez's atmospheric research had evolved into a comprehensive study of microclimate effects in various terrain types. The research station in Santos's Valley had become the headquarters for an international atmospheric monitoring network that studied environmental conditions affecting long-range ballistics worldwide. Martinez's research revealed that Santos's mountain valley possessed unique atmospheric characteristics that made it an ideal natural laboratory for studying environmental effects on long-range shooting. The combination of elevation, terrain features, and climate patterns created atmospheric phenomena that were more pronounced than those found in most other locations. The research findings explained why Santos had developed such exceptional environmental sensitivity and why the valley had produced other skilled hunters throughout history. The natural environmental conditions served as a training ground that enhanced atmospheric awareness in people who spent significant time observing and working with the local weather patterns. Santos's father's rifle, which had accomplished the impossible 4-kilometer shot, was eventually donated to a military museum where it became part of an exhibit about the evolution of marksmanship techniques. The simple hunting weapon that had succeeded where sophisticated military systems failed became a symbol of the value of traditional knowledge and environmental awareness. However, Santos kept her father's hunting philosophy and environmental knowledge, continuing to use those techniques for their original purpose of providing food for her family and guiding visitors through the mountain terrain that remained her primary source of income and personal satisfaction. The international attention had brought unexpected prosperity to Santos's mountain community. The research station, training center, and educational programs provided employment opportunities for local residents and generated income that supported infrastructure improvements in the traditionally isolated valley. Young people from the community who might have been forced to leave for economic opportunities in distant cities could now find meaningful work that utilized their traditional mountain knowledge while incorporating modern scientific and educational approaches. The community evolved while preserving its essential character and environmental connection. Santos gradually reduced her involvement in formal training programs, preferring to focus on informal education that occurred during hunting expeditions and mountain guiding activities. She found that teaching environmental awareness in natural contexts was more effective than classroom-based instruction for developing the intuitive sensitivity that had made her shooting success possible. The visitors who came to learn from Santos included researchers, military personnel, competitive shooters, and traditional hunting enthusiasts. However, they also included people who simply wanted to understand how someone could develop such intimate knowledge of natural environmental patterns that they could detect atmospheric conditions invisible to scientific instruments. Santos's story had become larger than the single remarkable shot that had initially brought her to attention. Her achievements represented the value of traditional knowledge, the importance of environmental awareness, and the possibility that combining modern technology with ancient wisdom could produce capabilities that exceeded either approach alone. The mountain valley where Santos had grown up learning to read atmospheric conditions had become an international center for studying environmental effects on precision shooting and long-range ballistics. Yet the valley remained essentially unchanged, with the same peaks, weather patterns, and natural rhythms that had shaped Santos's understanding of how to work with rather than against natural forces. As Santos watched the morning mist clear from the familiar mountainous terrain, she reflected on how her simple hunting skills had influenced military training programs worldwide, while ultimately returning her to the quiet mountain life that had always been her primary source of satisfaction and purpose. The woman who had succeeded where 13 elite snipers failed had discovered that her greatest achievement wasn't the impossible shot itself, but rather the preservation and sharing of environmental knowledge that connected people with the natural world in ways that enhanced both practical skills and deeper understanding of atmospheric forces that shaped all human activities in mountain environments. The story that had begun with a desperate military mission and 13 failed attempts had evolved into a lasting legacy of enhanced environmental awareness that would benefit mountain communities, military operations, and scientific research for generations to come. Santos's techniques had proven that traditional knowledge and modern technology could work together to achieve capabilities that neither could accomplish independently.